Good evening and welcome to How We Vote and What It Means. My name is Nicoletta Piereddu. I'm the inaugural director of the Georgetown Humanities Initiative. This initiative, under the auspices of Georgetown College, aims to foster dialogues and collaborations across departments inspired by the integrative and inclusive educational mission of our university. I wish to thank Albert Tran, Director of Georgetown University Press and co-sponsor of tonight's event, and Stephanie Rojas, publicist at GeoPress, for their support. And a warm welcome as well to our 5 guests. In the year in which we have celebrated the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, securing the right to vote for women, and sadly also bade farewell to John Lewis, who risked his life to enfranchise African-American voters, 8 days after National Voter Registration Day and 34 more to go before Election Day, and what an election, the topic of tonight's discussion couldn't be more timely. If, as John Lewis repeatedly claimed, the vote is precious, it is the most powerful non-violent tool we have in a democracy, tonight, we will explore the complex mechanisms that enable the exercise of this fundamental democratic right. We will highlight the synergies, but also the inequities that emerge from different settings and institutions. And we will reflect upon the implications for the overall significance of voting. We will do so with the authors of the book, How We Vote, Innovation in American Elections, published by Georgetown University Press this year, a few months ago, in conversation with 3 Georgetown scholars who will offer their perspectives from different research fields.
Thank you, Nicoletta. As Nicoletta mentioned, I'm Al Bertrand, Director of Georgetown University Press, and I'm delighted this evening to introduce Kathleen Hale and Mitchell Brown, the authors of How We Vote. Kathleen is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Auburn University, where she directs the graduate program in election administration. She's the author of award-winning How Information Matters, Networks and Policy Innovation. Mitchell is also a professor in the Department of Political Science at Auburn and associate editor of the Journal of Political Science Education. Kathleen and Mitchell direct the Election Administration Initiative at Auburn, and together they have co-authored several other books, including Applied Research Methods in Public and Nonprofit Organizations. Thank you both so much for being here tonight.
And now, our Georgetown panelists in alphabetical order. Hans Noel is Associate Professor of Government. He received his PhD from UCLA in 2006. His research revolves around political coalitions, political parties, and ideology, with a focus on the United States. He is the author of Political Ideologies and Political Parties in America, and co-author of The Party Decides, Presidential Nominations Before and After Reform. Professor Noel also blogs on political parties and related issues at Mischiefs of Faction. Please check it out. Diana Owen is professor in the Communication, Culture and Technology graduate program and director of the Civic Education Research Lab at Georgetown. Her current research explores the emergence and consequences of new political media, as well as how civic education prepares young people for citizenship in the digital age. She has published widely in the fields of media and politics, elections and voting behavior, political engagement, civic education, and political socialization. Among her books, Media Messages in American Presidential Elections, New Media and American Politics, and The Internet and Politics, Citizens, Voters, and Activists. Robert Patterson is professor in the Department of African American Studies, in which he also served as inaugural chair. His research focuses on Black cultural production, racial politics, and the legacies of slavery. Among his publications, the books Destructive Desires, Rhythm and Blues, Culture and the Politics of Racial Equality, Exodus Politics, Civil Rights and Leadership in African American Literature and Culture, and the edited volume, Black Cultural Production After Civil Rights. Currently, he is working on a book titled Black Equity, Black Equality, Reparation, and Black Communities. Now, just a few words on the structure of our event. Kathleen Hale and Mitchell Brown will introduce the main points of their book. Then the panelists will engage in a conversation connecting various ideas from the book to the respective research fields. We will then move to questions, including questions from the audience. So please feel free to submit your questions through the question and answer function. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen now. We want to thank everyone from Georgetown University Press for their help and work with us on this book, for putting together this webinar. Thank particularly the amazing group of scholars from Georgetown who are with us this evening. We're excited to be here. As Nicoletta just said, I'm going to start with a brief overview of what we've done in the book for anyone in the audience who hasn't read it, and then Kathleen's going to highlight some of our big takeaways. Over the past decade, Kathleen and I have worked in the election field, working with election officials from around the country, and visited election offices, spoken with election officials extensively. And what we saw in that work didn't really match up with the narrative that began in the 2016 election. We saw challenges, to be sure, shifting policy arrangements, new roles for various actors, new actors entering the space. But what we saw more than anything else was really a good government story about improvement, a real innovation to address significant challenges, particularly under significant constraints. So our purpose in writing this book was really untangle how innovation was actually happening or not, and why or why not innovation was happening. So we spent several years following the 2016 election then collecting data from around the country, interviewing people, conducting focus groups, surveying people, observing election officials, observing political processes around elections, collecting other kinds of data. And as we did this, we constantly reflected on what we were seeing. From those reflections, then we developed what you see on the screen here. We refer to this as our innovation theory of change. This is big concepts about how public services are delivered in the context of federalism, things like cooperation, collaboration in governments, undergirded by characteristics of the system, things like complexity, interdependence, accountability, and politics. And added to all this, we knew we needed to be able to measure change and determine something about success or failure. Golly, I've gone too far. So we pulled in from the real established literature about studies of diffusion and innovation and comparative state politics to conceptualize and create a model of measurable drivers of innovation, as well as the things that stop innovation from happening. This gave us the model that you see here. So throughout the book, what we do is examine various aspects or subsystems of election administration in the US, within the roles of politics, demands on systems, resource allocations, and professionalism, all within that broader theory, innovation theory of change, and given various state contextual factors on whether and how these innovations are implemented. So we do this in 6 areas through the book: registration and access, convenience voting methods, language assistance, counting and certification, equipment and security, and measurement. I'm going to turn it over here to Kathleen to talk more about what we find. You're muted, Kathleen.
Okay, thanks, Mitchell. Quickly summarize the sort of in 2 ways: a higher level set of findings and then a higher order finding in the next few slides. Across all of those topic areas that Mitchell mentioned, we looked at the influence of politics, professionalism, resources, and demands, and conclude across areas that there are, not surprisingly, real partisan views about participation that interact with innovation. In looking at the professionalization of the sector, which has occurred and is occurring even more rapidly now, We saw the influence of networks and partner organizations, some real significant influence of resources in two ways. One, the influence of the private sector, and the other is the lack of resources, particularly at the local level, which is where elections happen. And then in terms of demands across these areas, we found in a variety of ways the implications of outdated systems of registration, of different kinds of equipment connections, those sorts of things. And so I've got two sort of bigger ways to think about this. And if we looked at this whole thing across the 20 years that we examined it, we could see both shifts in power and the tensions between those shifts in power with the complexity of the system. And so I'll just highlight a couple of those for you here. Implementation of elections still remains essentially a local game, although local resources are stagnant in the face of some really pressing new requirements, not just cybersecurity starting in 2016-17, but the current pandemic dynamic. Since 2000, alongside this sort of stagnant pool of state experiences, or local experiences, excuse me, you have states rising in their relative power and authority as a result of HAVA, as a result of recent CARES Act funding, as a result of being the pass-throughs for cybersecurity support. So local power is constrained in that way. Federal power or state power is rising. Federal power related to equity, which is a major role for the national government to play in this field, has declined after 2013, although federal influence has increased a little bit in some functional areas. Let me take you inside the tensions that the shifts in power have created inside just three of the areas that we look at in the book. And the point here is to think about complexity and to think about complexity from the point of view of the local election administrator. I have illustrations, some schematics of a model voter registration system, a change of address process, and the mail balloting process across the states. The point isn't to pay any attention to any particular detail, but perhaps to notice the detail and the complexity. Really quickly in the center of this, you can see that we have a statewide voter registration database and an LEO, or local election official or office, taking in information from voters in person, online, through third-party groups, through NVRA agencies, and more. You have different sorts of equipment feeding into this, including electronic poll books. You have a maintenance function that is connected to outside organizations, outside the local office. Some of these are government entities, some of them are private entities. NCOA the National Change of Address, has been in the news recently as a data source for local officials that has been disrupted. So we can take a look also then at the next item, which is change of address. If we loved voter registration, we love change of address even more. This is a generic but very true to the experiences in local jurisdictions about the steps that they go through to move from receiving information about change of address at the top left through a variety of checks and processes to decide whether the voter's name stays on the rolls as is or whether it's removed from the rolls. Some of these processes aren't necessarily tremendously technically complicated, but you can see here the sequence and the system that has to occur in order for the eligibility of the voter, in order for their franchise to be maintained. And the last thing that we'll look at is for complexity that's interacting with these different sort of shifts in power away from local government, quite frankly, is the complexity of the mail ballot system. And here you can just see, you can see a lot. We looked at mail ballot processes all over the country, not in the context of the current experience that we're having. This research was completed before 2020. But you can see that there are multiple ways that voters can request ballots. There are multiple ways that the Postal Service becomes involved. There are different verification processes. There are different sorts of delivery options that happen. There are things that happen when we receive mail. We might ignore it, we might lose it, it might be lost in the mail. Any number of dynamics that can occur. And so the point of all this is simply that this is a tiny, tiny window inside what's going on inside the local election office, interacting with political demands, interacting with resources, interacting with the professional levels of their staff, and trying to make sense of a process that has evolved historically from a pretty simple process at the local level. And so what we did was look at innovations against that sort of backdrop. And with that, I want to turn it over to the panelists to hear their questions and their comments.
All right. Well, that was a nice summary of the main argument of the book. And I'd like to just make a couple of comments about the book. And really, I'm interested to hear what Kathleen and Mitchell have to say about so many interesting questions that the book raises. I've been since I've got the book and been talking to folks and doing various events and panels and so forth, the number of times that I've come back and said, you know, either I've been able to say, oh, well, now I have an answer to that question because I read the book. Or even better, to a number of things that like, well, actually, you know, the answer is you should come to this event on Wednesday, or you should read this book because they'll be able to explain better than I can. Because the number of times that these kinds of issues are now coming up because of this current cycle has been a lot. And so what I wanted to do is first just address that exact point that I think for a lot of people who are here to hear about this book, you probably are here in part because questions about how we vote and how voting works and what works, what the implications of it and everything are maybe a little bit motivated by current events, right? How voting, how ballots play out and how they get counted. Like they were a topic in the debate last night. Like this is, you know, the mechanics of it are now controversial and a thing that we discuss. And as a consequence, people have a lot of questions and are interested in it. And I would like to hear some thoughts from the authors about that. But before we do that, I want to cast a light on this book in a different context, the way that I think it was originally written, which was not in context of the current crisis or current politicization of this, not that it wasn't already politicized, but the way that it was politicized before. Because this is a really important and interesting book of political science before the current moment, about how a very important piece of democracy is actually conducted, and about the politics and just the efforts that are, you know, the sheer, you know, administration of making that happen, right? And it's complicated. So I teach the general intro to American politics class. I think maybe some of my students are here in the session. I hope so. If they are, they're getting extra credit. We often end up with questions that you get questions from people about, like, why can't we just do this, or why doesn't voting just work this way? And one of the things that is really difficult for people to grasp is just how radically federal the United States is, but especially our election administration, right? That is something, is because it's a federal election, we're electing the president, but really it is 51 state elections that are administered. And then even beyond that, 51 elections that in some cases involve delegation to local entities and the like. And so not only just getting your head around that is complicated, which the book initially does a good job of outlining and laying the groundwork for that. But then if you want to make changes and improvements to that, you don't do it at the national level. You can do some things at the national level, but ultimately the place to make changes has to be on the ground in the states. And the process is going to be, different in every state. And yet what this book does is create a political science theory about how to think about that, what can be unified across those things. And so what I really find useful here is then to think about what are the common factors that matter for trying to make changes place to place. And that's the framework that you just saw laid out. And so I think that's really useful to get that story across. And if all you wanted to know was just let me understand how federalism works and how policy it happens at the federal level, independent of the importance of this issue, this is a really important and interesting book for those purposes. But it's also about an important topic that is important in its own right, even if you didn't care about why it happens. And so that's the other half of it. And that's the reason why I think probably we have as many people in the session today, and probably why the issue is so highly relevant here, because one of the main things that I think you can sort of define the arc of American politics about, the American history of American politics, has been about both the expansion of the franchise, but also the contraction and the adjustment and the shifting of the franchise, who gets to vote and how and where and how those changes happen. And we generally tend to focus on just like the expansion of the franchise, the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, those things, which are big changes. But all these little things are just as important, maybe sometimes more important because they're hard to see. So those dynamics are really, really critical. And they're much more tricky to implement and to put into place. And so what I'd like to do is leave with I'd like to move on because I think we'll have some interesting questions from the audience, but to leave with the authors this question about now. Because right now we're in this sort of crisis mode with the coronavirus and a lot of quick changes. Here in DC, we're now getting ballots that are being mailed to us. The ballots are being mailed to us because the plan that we used for the primary, where you requested ballots if you wanted to do it by mail, didn't work because it didn't happen fast enough. And so there was this like sudden quick change, which at first I'm just curious how that quick adaptation, that quick change fits into your model, right? That there was like a need, right? But it was also like, sort of this panic mode need and this really quick adjustment. Usually you think that there's a long, hard push to make this effort, and yet there's the sudden need. So how does that fit into the model from a political science side? But then also thinking to the other end of this, there's a lot of concern and pressure, and I was having a conversation earlier today with a group, and they were asking about, well, how can we fix this concern and that concern about how things work? What can we do? And part of the answer was, well, this is how it works. But right now, there's a lot of attention to the system, and including a lot of attention of couldn't we reform it in these ways? So is this a moment where, because there's a lot of attention, both because of the controversies, but also because of the coronavirus needs, that could spur a wave of innovation or change? And if so, what might that look like? And so I'm curious what you'll have to say about that, and when we get to getting answers from questions. But I think the other panelists also probably have some interesting thoughts, and I'll pass the baton on to them.
Okay.
And I'm not sure who's next.
Yeah.
Happy to go next and add some contributions to the chapter, not to the chapter, to this conversation and to this wonderful book. So thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts. So for me, I really want to come from the perspective of African-American studies, and particularly a discipline that formed in the 1960s around the time of the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and the Fair Housing Act, and a discipline itself that is very concerned with how scholarship is able to have impacts on the actual living in the communities of which it's thinking about and working toward. And so when I'm thinking about the arguments that the book makes about the administration of elections and the resources that are provided, it's important, I think, to think in the context of how the politics of race specifically, and the movement to, on the one hand, legislatively expand the franchise, but in practice, contract the franchise within Black communities, I think is important, particularly as we listen to what's happening in this current election with ballots, with USPS, within the communities in particular where some of these challenges are emerging. And so as I think about this book, I'm really compelled to think about Carol Anderson's White Rage, particularly because she describes white rage as an aggression that emerges in the post-Reconstruction era, where Black people having come out of slavery and Black men having the right to vote are now making political progress. They are being seated in different legislatures, and there's great concern that that advancement is going to upset the racial imbalances that had occurred because of their inabilities to vote. And so part of what I think is important to note is that when we get to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which sets in place some checks and balances on, for example, the history of poll taxes, literacy tests, and all of the mechanisms that were designed to contract Black enfranchisement, that comes out of a long history where the Black vote was either diluted or otherwise not counted. And if you look at what happened in, for example, Wilmington, North Carolina, the race riots in Atlanta, part of what happens at the turn of the 20th century is there's actually, literally stuffing ballot boxes to do that. And so I raise that context because I think that the work that Carol Anderson lays out there, the work that she then does in One Vote, alongside some of the work that we see in Ava DuVernay's 13, and most recently Stacey Abrams's All In, really gets to illustrate that some of these conversations that perhaps are sometimes seemingly seemingly make sense, right? So what is the big deal, for example, about someone showing an ID in order to vote? Well, the big deal, I think, is actually much to do with how, number one, DMVs in predominantly Black and brown areas have been closed. It also has to do with the fact that, or the hours have been diminished. And so the point here is that there are obstructions that are intentionally, it seems, put in place to curtail that vote. And so I think that it's important when we have conversations about the processes to call attention to the way that race implicitly in the post-civil rights era are always a part, it seems, of those calculations. And so you can go back to the decision in North Carolina, where with their voting ID law, one of their voting ID laws, you can go to the decision in Texas, where you can see that there is, to one judge, surgical precision, where the efforts are being made to contract and dilute Black voters, to discourage Black people from voting by sowing confidence, by making people not confident in the integrity of the system. And so I raise that point just to say that I think it's important when we talk about the systems and how they're implemented and how the local election offices have the constraints, budgetary, and the law, just to really call into question, to point our attention to the fact that there has historically been, and even in the contemporary moment, specific ways that laws, practices, and policies are designed, sometimes unintentionally, but oftentimes intentionally, with the intended outcome of diminishing the power of the Black vote. And I think that that's important to highlight in those processes, and hopefully we can talk about some of that more as we go on.
Well, first of all, thank you for including me on this panel. The book is extremely timely. It's very important. And the authors have a tremendous amount of insight to share about how we vote. And I learned a great deal from this book, so I really just appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm going to look at or kind of give a perspective from someone who studies civic education and who's very passionate about educating young people for citizenship, and particularly to make sure that they exercise their right to vote. So as I was reading the book, I kept on thinking about the implications that it has for civic education, and the fact that so little of the essential information that this book conveys really makes it into civics, social studies, or basic American government classes. And I'm guilty of that myself, having taught that. Then I got to the conclusion of the book, and the authors had this exact sentiment when they said, civics classes at all levels of school teach about what kinds of elections we have, but not how elections actually work. And I basically could not emphasize that the importance of that sentiment. So I decided that to take a look at some of the many American government textbooks that I have on my shelf, including the one that I co-authored. And wow, that was really disappointing, because the exercise only emphasized how much of the story of how we vote is missing from, you know, what we convey to young people when we're trying to tell them about civics and good citizenship. The chapter in How We Vote, there's a few of them. It's all great, but there's a few that really, I think, are must-reads. On Catalyst for Convenience Voting, which describes how voting has become easier over time, and the chapter on Administrative Innovations and Counting Ballots, which discusses how election results are verified. I think these should be kind of required readings in all Intro to American courses, starting at the high school or even middle school level. Even though the book is very sophisticated, I think the points in there are key. One of the things that the authors point out throughout the book is that the terminology used to describe even key elements of the voting process can mystify voters, and it can mystify students too. At the most basic level, they basically pose the question, what's a vote? That's, you know, it's not as simple as it seems. What is a provisional ballot? And why does that make a difference? And what if you have to, you know, cast a provisional ballot? There's some good examples in the book about that. What exactly does vote by mail mean? These are terms that young voters and even every voter really needs to understand, and I think is not really conveyed as well or as carefully as they should be through our education process, whether it be in the classroom or outside of it. The authors brought to light many points that should be front and center in the civic education process about voting, but I'm going to just touch on a few of them here, and some of them have actually been touched on by the other speakers already, but I'll just kind of discuss them within the context that I'm looking at things in. By reading standard American government textbooks and paying attention to the news media, students would likely get the impression that the national government has an exceptional role and major power in the election process. There's little discussion of the implications of the federal structure of government and how that applies to how we vote. Students might also be left with the impression that the American voting process is highly coordinated and centralized, when in fact, as we've heard from others on the panel already, a central theme that the authors convey throughout the book is that the responsibility for elections is held largely at the state level and implemented locally. The US Constitution vests powers over elections first and foremost with state legislatures. And historically, as the authors point out, the national government has gotten involved when there is systematic violation of citizens' rights, which we just heard about from Robert, and we should discuss that further. The role of federal agencies in elections is largely advisory. And the individual state responses to federal policy have resulted in unique political and cultural voting configurations. And as Hans said, you know, basically there's many, many different ways of voting that are all determined at the state and local level. The complexity of the election system, which we've also heard about, is another aspect of the process that requires greater attention. The authors describe the American election administration environment as, quote, perhaps the most intractably complex policy environment in which public managers operate. And I think after reading the book, I would have to agree with that. Not only does the process involve working across levels of government, it also requires a staggering number of people and organizations to administer elections and to institute the innovations that are discussed in the book. These go beyond the government entities to include vendors who provide the required hardware and software for voters, advocacy groups, nonprofit voting organizations, academics, think tanks. And as the authors illustrate through some good examples in the book, there's times that voters themselves can even get into the process of innovation and help inform the types of changes that are made in the voting process. Just kind of a personal example of having been thinking about this book this week. I renewed my driver's license, and when I was at the DMV, I was presented with a screen that asked me to review my voter registration information, make sure my party ID was right, and make sure that everything was current. And I thought, wow, the network of people extends across agencies that you wouldn't even think, are involved. And while I was there, I actually heard one of the DMV workers explaining the whole voter registration process to another client who didn't have much awareness or knowledge of what it meant to have this offered. And I thought, boy, they also have to be knowledge, even if you work at the DMV, about how to carry out the registration process. So knowing how to vote depends very much upon knowing what the laws and practices are in your own voting locale. And acquiring this information, I think, can be especially difficult for young people who don't have much experience with the political process, and clearly from civic education, I think, have been lacking in the kind of details that we need to know about the process, particularly at the local level. They're highly mobile. They have to deal with different laws and practices when they change locations. And they're also, in some sense, perhaps less motivated to find out than, kind of older voters. I have to say that one theme that really stood out for me in the book was the importance of the local elections officials, who often are entirely overlooked in the civics classroom and in media coverage, except perhaps when something goes wrong and we hear news reports about what happened there. And the authors actually point out that local and state election administrators have been at the forefront of developing innovative ways for improving the electoral system. I kind of came away from the book with the sense that the LEOs are something of the heroes of the story. They have a lot of professionalism. They seem to have a sense of wanting to do a good job. They take pride in what they're doing. And I have to, sometimes the book just says it better than I can. So I'm going to just read from the book a summary of this sentiment. Quote, despite what happens at the national or state level, in most places in the United States, the primary drivers of high-quality election processes and innovations are the local officials who work under fixed time constraints with small or minuscule budgets and few personnel, and who nonetheless clearly are able to develop creative solutions for problems in their election systems and subsystems. So it's clear from the book that the authors, I think, have an intimate knowledge of what happens at the local level, especially among the local election officials. They mention, among other motivations, that they have a great desire to do good work. So here's my question. I'm wondering if you have any sense of how local officials are responding to the attacks on the election process that are being made by Donald Trump and other national politicians at the current time. And I guess I was thinking that maybe they're doing their job and trying their best to stay above the fray. And I guess I'm very hopeful, kind of reading your book and the account of how seriously they take their job, that maybe we have some hope for the current situation. And then finally, I just wanted to reflect on one of the remedies that the authors suggest for getting young people to be more knowledgeable about and kind of have more faith in the system, which is to encourage them to serve as poll workers during the election process, which I think is going to be something that's going to be more prominent in this campaign. I know my husband signed up to be a poll worker, but Montgomery County will not let him do it anymore because of the age limit. And so it seems as if there's an opportunity and also a movement, including on the part of, there's people at Georgetown that are doing it, but also the American Political Science Association is having an effort to get people young people to work at the polls. So that concludes my statements. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I guess there is much food for thought. I don't know whether Mitchell or Kathleen want to answer in the order you prefer to engage with the questions, and then we can build from that. Thank you.
Sure. Well, what Mitchell and I thought we would do, because we could spend hours talking about this, is each take a little bite at each of the topics that sort of the categories of things that y'all brought up, and I'll start, and maybe we can, Mitchell, you can pick which one you want to do next. But I thought I would respond to Hans first, and this idea of time, and the idea of a quick change, and how the system is positioned for that, and how we think about that, or how we consider that in terms of innovation. And wanted to just give you an example, a local example of the magnitude of the quick change. Again, I think the details matter. In the DC primary, June 23rd or so, whenever it was, the number of mail ballots requested in previous comparable years had been something like 9,000 or 10,000, and in this year, June 23rd, 2020, the number was more than 90,000. So it's not a little change that happens sometimes. It's huge, and to be able to respond to those kinds of things, we not only need resources at the local level, but we also need time. Many conversations with people very, very interested in what's happening right now, and the cake's baked in terms of what election officials are doing right now. The train's on the track, people are voting. And so we've just started to pay attention, good for us. But this is a process that is a constant process. It's a constant aspect of local government. And so I do think, Hans, that there are going to be a lot of really interesting pressures for change coming out of the current circumstances, to the extent that they don't involve resources and they don't involve a real consideration of the time that's involved to manage this really essentially a complex supply chain. We'll miss opportunities.
Yeah, I'll just add to that a couple of things to Hans's question, and then I'll turn it over to Robert's question. And then back to Kathleen. I would say, as you were talking, Hans, and thank you to all of you for your comments. They were generous and much kinder than I expected. So I appreciate it. But there was this, implied in some of your questions was like, how on earth do we get here, and who's holding the bag right now? And I would say that we've got this like weird landscape of all these rules and practices, and they're very much a path-dependent process, right, that goes back hundreds of years. And who's holding the bag right now really is state legislatures. And so we've got these amazing election officials for the most part, right? You can't use a broad brush about everything, but really amazing local election officials, hamstrung in some ways by state legislative rules. And so from a political science model side, and looking at the model we use, there's this real demand pressure right now. And the other piece of this is a leadership story about local leadership and important things coming out of local leadership. And so that's what I would add to that. And that's also sort of covering some of what Kathleen said. To Robert's comments, yeah, absolutely. I would start with Carol Anderson and this idea about white rage, what happens during and following Reconstruction and through the 20th century, right? We've got these intentional and constant efforts, particularly at Black voter suppression and the power, suppressing the power of Black people generally through voting as one, major way. The VRA comes, part of, I think the most glaring example of that and the legacy of that today is this patchwork of felon disenfranchisement laws across the country that are seemingly race neutral but disproportionately affect the Black community, particularly Black men. And, again, this is state legislatures holding the bag about this. There's a lot of discussion right now about these other attempts to very, very subtly get at Black voter suppression. It's hard with these seemingly race-neutral kinds of rules and policies to tease that out. But the really complicating factor in the election administration story about that is, and you see this in that Stacey Abrams movie to an extent, is about, you know, what is intentional and what's not, what role might implicit bias play in these volunteers who get in part of this process, because we have this system that is under-resourced and implemented by largely, you know, on the ground by volunteers, and so this is a really complicated thing to tease out. And I don't know what else you want to add to that, Kathleen.
So, well, I have lots of thoughts, and I really appreciate your comments, Robert, as well. And so often when the word integrity is used with respect to elections recently, it's sort of been, you know, co-opted by cybersecurity and the integrity of the electronic process or the counting mechanisms or whatever. And I think it's really important to remember that the bedrock of the way we measure democracy, which is our election system, is that it has integrity. That's having faith in that system. For all of us to have faith in that system, I think is essential. I also think it's worth us always remembering that administration, the public administration of political decisions, implementation, is not neutral. We struggle with that across all policy fields. We struggle with it in this one too. We had we had the Voting Rights Act for a number of reasons, one of which was that administrative practices were not neutral. They were clearly not neutral. And so that razor's edge is something that continues. And, you know, one of the interesting things I think about the Voting Rights Act is you know, there's a lot of focus on the Shelby decision, and, you know, the fact that it basically takes the lid off and, you know, opens the box, and, you know, there's no real brakes on the system anymore. And I think that there's real concern about that. Another part of it is the way in which we as a country very skillfully removed explicit consideration of the Voting Rights Act in the reauthorizations. We were going on at a really nice clip early on, 65, 70, 75, 82. And in 82, we take the biggest chunk of it, Section 5, and we take it off the table in a beautiful reauthorization, widely hailed and praised, that lasts for 25 years. And so there's no trigger, there's no, you know, well, we've done that, it's over, we don't have to reconsider it. And we do this again in 2006, and then, you know, to the effect that we have. And so it's a very, 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 it's an odd place for local election officials to be, because there's a real tension between policy decisions that they have to implement and implementation itself. And I'll say this, it's adjacent and maybe not directly to your points, that there's a real difference between bad policy decisions or policy decisions that I don't agree with, let's say, and the ideology in a policy decision, and bad implementation, or under-resourced or impossible implementation. And so, you know, broader education about this, I think, certainly won't resolve everything in the next hot second, but it's imperative to understand that there's more, that the local election official is caught in this place. So if we're going to follow our pattern here, Mitchell, I'll jump on and offer just a couple of comments to Diana's observances and her really really very generous comments, pretty interesting. You know, the things that you're seeing now at the vote at the DMVs are the result of the National Voter Registration Act that was passed in 1993. And from a local election official's perspective, that integration, we're just now really getting it together. We're just now really getting it together. Some of it has to do with technology. You know, everybody started, you know, 40 years ago with paper records. Everybody decided to choose a new electronic system. None of these things are coordinated easily, and so that's a long, slow. I'm actually glad that you had the experience that you did. There are some others too. Two quick other comments. One is in terms of what we might like to see going forward in terms of civic education. I've commented to other people in other sorts of conversations and events that what we really need is a STEM we need a STEM program for civics. There's all kinds of resources available for science, technology, engineering, and math. You know, this is no less important than that. And so, and the last thing, and then I'll turn it over to Mitchell, is that you asked about how local officials are responding. They have their heads down. They are completely engaged. They are working their plans. They have made, and I would use the word heroic, they've made extraordinary efforts to do the job. They understand very, very, very well what the pressures are and what the stakes are and the constraints that they have for operating the election and then certifying the ballots and then reporting the results.
Yeah, so the only thing I'd add to that is a quick anecdote, and thank you, Diana, again for your comments. And this is about the mystifying terminology and obscure rules and the nuance in some of this. I got a call just last Friday from a friend of mine who's a political scientist and a friend of Hans and Kathleen's, who's the director of a school, really accomplished fellow, and he was telling me that he was in the process of being disenfranchised. Because he was trying to, he tried to get a Uokava vote ballot and turn it in because he was leaving the country and he would be gone during the election, and he misunderstood one single line in what he was supposed to do, and sent it in, and they called him back and said, no, no, you don't get to vote. And so he was trying to fix it, and he was so frustrated. And so, and so speaking to this about civics education is, the mechanics of how we do this, the rules we have to follow are, they're straightforward until the second they're not. And it makes the role of the local election officials even more important for being able to explain this and for having some kind of wiggle room for helping people correct when they've made really simple errors so they don't get disenfranchised.
Just as a follow-on for everyone and the topics, one of the things that we could hope would come out of this intense experience that we're having right now is that there is sort of a permanently raised level of awareness about the details, and that the details are actually there and that they actually matter, and that paying attention to them earlier, much earlier, even earlier than March when we all started talking about voting by mail around the country, much earlier.
The media own a share of the blame in this too, the way they simplify these processes and the problems, and politicians doesn't help anybody.
No, I love the horse race as much as anybody does. As many media channels as I can have during the election season on all the time. I get it, and I certainly am interested, although not for the purposes of the research that I do, but as a citizen, I'm interested in who wins and who doesn't. But even just the language about first it started with elections, not knowing the results on election night. Well, and if you called every election at the close of the polls on election night, you would by definition disenfranchise voters. And it has always been that way. It's just so much more obvious now. And if we could find better words that have really sort of no implication, right? Late results, late returns, the idea that and it's subtle, and I don't know that it's necessarily poorly intentioned, because I have seen a shift over the last couple of months in particular in this sort of idea that we won't know, but the words that we use to describe how we won't know, it better to be accurate than quick. Quick won't be accurate.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe we can start with the open questions. I don't know, maybe Al, would you like to contribute, breaking the ice? And again, the audience is very welcome to submit questions through the Q&A. There is already one. We can go to that question directly, or maybe if Al wants to start.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll start off kind of picking up on the last topic of discussion. It strikes me that, there's a kind of series of tensions between your outstanding book, this work of political science, as Hans described it, and kind of the way these issues are talked about in the media and in the public. So I kind of wanted to cut straight to the chase and ask you about something that I think is on all our minds. So we've talked a lot about, the election really being 51 elections, the importance of local officials. But at the same time, we have a president standing up and saying, I may not accept the results of this election, which implies a kind of immense power on the part of the presidency in terms of, say, certifying the election results. So I wonder if you could speak a little to that, and in particular, what opportunities there would be for this president or any president to kind of frustrate the results of an election.
Kathleen and I are staring at each other. Who's going to I'll jump in and say some things, and then she can make it better. So what I would say is presidents don't have power to certify anything. This happens at the state level, period. Certainly there's a lot of concern out there about what a president who says he won't accept the results of an election might do. I've got wild scenarios in my head about what kind of constitutional crisis might be created from this. And I think it's within the realm of possibility that what will happen, and what both parties are gearing up for right now, are a series of lawsuits in contested places, and that at least in some really important ways, that parts of the election might turn on court decisions, right? But presidents don't have the power to do this, period. And so add on, Kathleen.
Yeah, no, no president does. That said, and I'll defer to everybody on the call and everyone in the discipline who is an expert on Congress and state legislatures, because I am not. This is a story about parties, and it's a story about, it's a story about the math across the states and the methods that they use to choose electors. There have been a number of judicial decisions that sort of lay the groundwork in some good ways, and some others that leave some room open. I think this is an illustration, or this is going to be an experience where all of the pressure points are exposed, where with enough resources, everyone can apply as much pressure to those as possible, whether it's poll watchers, whether it's, how state courts might interpret deadlines for counting ballots, for accepting ballots. I have to say that I feel that there is a general tone of openness about the process, that voters should be allowed to vote, voters should be allowed to vote in the ways that make sense to them, that we should use the methods that we have, we should use early voting and vote by mail, and we should have, the pressure will come for jurisdictions that use excuse-based absentee voting, or multiple notaries and signatures and witnesses, that'll start to ease up as we see that there are other states, many states, that can do this very successfully without those requirements. And so I'm not interested in being in a sort of the prediction game about what might happen. That all of the levers that I can imagine are in play, and they're all political. They're all political levers, whether it's the courts or state legislatures. The president's power in this is not the interesting part of the story.
Thank you.
So I'd add to that I think the single most dangerous thing right now is widespread distrust in the system.
Absolutely agree with that. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you. I wish to draw from the Q&A area here. There is an interesting question that follows up on Robert's contextualization of how we vote in terms of how some people are prevented from voting. And so the question expresses a concern about voter purges, such as those perpetrated by Crosscheck. And the reference is to the Brennan Center, which found that 4 states have conducted illegal purges. So the question for the authors is whether any of the election officials they interviewed had come up with either innovations or processes to prevent illegal voter purges, and also to provide some methods for voters to learn when they are removed. The comment is, it's not realistic for each voter to constantly check to see if they are currently registered. And so the question wonders how close to the election people are allowed to be purged. What do they do when they show up to vote and they find that they're not registered when they had just checked recently? So do voters have any rights in this situation?
Okay, wow, those are a lot of questions, and so I'll pick off one at the top and say that there is a competing sort of there's an innovation that we write about in our book. We know it as ERIC. It's the Electronic Registration Information Center, and it is a multi-state consortium run by a nonprofit organization that states choose to belong, and Crosscheck is similar, but the algorithms that they use and methods that they use are different. And Crosscheck has been criticized and become less popular over the last decade, in our estimation, because it reported the way it was constructed reported a lot of false positives to suggest that voters should be removed when they shouldn't. And so ERIC is wildly popular, very sophisticated system that matches information across states, and so that's a piece of the answer to many questions here.
Yeah, I'd add to that I think we have to be careful about language and not buying into partisan hype and partisan fights. The use of the term purge versus the use of cleaning rolls is pretty important here. We have to be able to have administrative processes for all kinds of reasons for removing people from roles. And when we don't, you know, on the other hand, you have people like lose their minds because there are dead people on the rolls. Well, if we can't remove people from the rolls, then you're going to have bloated rolls, right? And so, so there has to be a process that doesn't disenfranchise people, that allows election officials to clean up those roles. And when we use words like purging, you know, we're further fomenting distrust in the system and what happens when people are trying to clean up these administrative processes. And there are certainly safeguards, right? If you go to the polls and you find your name not on the roll and you expect it to be, that's why we have provisional ballots. And, you know, so there's a both and here. Kathleen, you want to add to that?
Yeah, there's a, you know, NVRA sets up a, you know, 90-day period before federal elections where the rolls are supposed to remain stable. Match that up with 40 million people or more move every year, and we have an election system that is place-based. Our political system is a system of political geography. Each of one of us walks around with a, you know, unique latitude and longitude that is our space for voting. And when we move that, depending on the rules of our state, that has implications. This would be part of our STEM for voting curriculum, which I'm trying to sketch out here while we're talking. So that's a piece. That's a piece. There have been cases, and again, we're not talking about a paper system. We're talking about sophisticated electronic registries. And so, you know, there are ways to do these things, and some ways are more professional and have better results than others. We get the democracy we pay for. Oh, and to follow up on the very last part of that question, the provisional ballot, everyone should be able to choose that as a fail-safe. That was part of the Help America Vote Act. Everyone should be able to choose that, and states have different processes for allowing you to correct misinformation, but that process is very real and very active.
Great, thank you very much. The second question regards, so goes in the direction of what Diana raised earlier about education of the general public. And the question is, how can the general public, not necessarily school-age children, be better educated about the voting process in a non-political way?
Well, the simple way is to read the rules, and that sounds like, you know, it sounds like a terrible thing to say, and given the example that I gave just a few minutes ago about my friend who read the rules but read them wrong, you know, that's a tough thing. But there are you know, voters have rights, and they should. Voters probably have some responsibilities as well, and not taking voting for granted and not taking the rules for granted. I would say almost all election offices have their rules, you know, online. There are ways to find them. There might be better ways for election offices to do voter outreach and education. And there might be better ways for the media to do voter outreach and education. But, you know, but they're there, and people just don't think about it until they need to.
Yeah, they don't. For all of us, I've been asked many times why this is so complicated for people to understand. And I think some of it has to do with the way many of us learned to vote when we were in, you know, in grade school. You know, shoebox with a hole cut in the top, and you write something on a piece of paper and you fold it in half and you stick it in the box, and teacher counts the votes, and, you know, we're off to the races. It's done, right? And so there's never anything I have never encountered anything beyond that point that looks at the mechanics of this and educates future voters about what their responsibilities are and what they should remember to do. It's true that much of what you know, much of what Mitchell and I have been able to catalog and capture in this book is, you know, it's well established in the world. It's knowable, and so being able to share that, you know, being able to share that with people who are interested in teaching it would be fun.
Al, would you like to ask a question, or shall we continue? We have 3 more questions from the audience, so it's up to you.
I can maybe ask one from the audience. So, and I'll just preface it with this comment that my wife is British, and I think when people come from a very unitary kind of centralized state like the UK, when I got my instructions for voting in Maryland the other day, it was like a 15-page pamphlet, you know, and my wife's reaction was kind of like, you know, in Britain, you show up, you put your paper in the box, like you were saying, by 3 in the morning, you know who's prime minister, you know, the system's never failed. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to, so that's a preface to a question, which is that, do you all agree that state-run decentralized administrative elections is an effective deterrent to large-scale fraud and is actually a strength to our election system as opposed to greater federal control of elections? So I wondered if you could speak a little bit to the sort of tension between the local and the national. Would it be better to have more national involvement in elections?
Oh my, I'm going to say one thing and then have Mitchell talk. I would change the phrasing of your question, Al, to locally run elections. States are involved in the elections process, but in the language world that we live in, local election offices run elections. States provide support, but local election officials run elections. The weight of that in this policy area is different than any other in my view. And yeah, Mitchell, go ahead. We've got things to say about this.
Yeah, I'll add to that earlier Hans was talking about we don't have one election in November, we've got 51.
Yeah.
That's not true. We've got over 8,000 elections in November, right? And if you multiply by all of the different smaller sub-districts, you know, we've got an exponential number of elections in November. And so one of the things that we argue at the end of the book is that these calls from various sides to move to a national election system we think are we think are miscalculated calls. We identify 3 big reasons. One is that having a decentralized system like we have actually helps protect the system from some kinds of nefarious actions, right, from bad actors. The other is that it also protects the system from party control. You know, so if we went to a national system, you know, you wouldn't have those same kinds of checks on party control. And you see this in some states where there's really very little party competition, and the people in power try and play with the rules so they can be sure to keep power, right? And so having a decentralized system serves as a check on that. And the third big one is that it continues to allow for innovation. And our big fear from looking at other policy areas where we've essentially moved to national systems is that innovation is very much stifled in those areas. Now, this doesn't mean we don't think that there's national responsibility here. When people's rights are being denied, it is the responsibility of the national government to ensure that those rights are maintained by citizens. And we also think that it's unfair to put the onus of the burden of funding elections squarely on the shoulders of local levels of government. And you know, to Kathleen's, you get the election you pay for, you get the democracy you pay for, that she said earlier, that, you know, that's absolutely true. And so there's a place for federal money, but there's not a place for a unified system. At least that's what we argue.
Yeah, I would add to that also that, you know, there's no evidence that a national administrative apparatus would be an improvement. It would, you know, let's say it could be willing to consider that, it would mean that what we would need to do is dig into all of the election laws and election practices and the administrative codes in the 50 states, the district, and the territories. Shout out to anyone from the territories who's on the call, and rewrite those codes so that we could have a common language, so that just something as simple as what we thought was simple, right? Mail-in ballots would actually mean the same thing, because it doesn't. And it doesn't, even if we talk about it and try to make those words real in the media. In the States, it's different. And so one of the questions, and this is a real question that Mitchell and I have been involved in with other folks around this space, is, you know, if you had all the money in the world, what would you do? And it wouldn't be that. The amount of money and time and leverage that it would take to change all of those practices, which are not freestanding administrative practices, you know, in some sort of agency or office that's devolved from the federal government in the first place. These are embedded in state constitutions. And so is that really what we want to do? And Mitchell and I have concluded, for the reasons, you know, that she's explained, that no, we don't think that's a good idea normatively, and we don't think it's a good use of resources either.
Great, thank you. You have mentioned innovation, and probably partially you have already answered one of the questions, but you know, maybe you can add something. One person in the audience inferred that innovation in elections is slow. Looks like it was not clear what the reason is for that being so, and so why is innovation in elections slow? Should that change? If so, how would we go about encouraging that it changed? So anything you may want to add to what seems already implicit in the previous answer?
Sure. That's a really, really great question. And I think there are a couple of pieces to the answer to it. One, maybe three. One is the level of complexity that exists. Even at the local level, making a change typically involves outside parties. Perhaps people who provide equipment or people who program software. There are other relationships that are necessary to move a process change along, and those are important, and they develop over time out of from my experience, a great deal of trust and communication and relationship building, which takes time. And so I think we argue that the complexity of this system and the relationships and the collaboration that's needed to hook all the pieces together in a political system takes time.
Yeah, I'd add to that a couple of other things that we saw, particularly in states that were able to innovate and do some really interesting things compared to places where they weren't. There's a little bit in here about how tightly bound election officials are around within state law, how much room they have, how much administrative discretion they have. There's also a story in here about how much resources they can use to leverage. And this is political resources, it's human resources, it's actual capital. And there's another piece of this story in some places it's really about visionary leadership, right? And the political will that some visionary leaders are really willing to put forward to make some of this change happen.
So is it okay if I ask a question, Nicoletta?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm intrigued because a minute ago you mentioned that you had ideas about what you would do if you had all the money in the world. And so I'm wondering what a few of them are.
Oh, I may regret having said that. One thing that I think is critical is to continue to improve the professionalization of the field. These positions where the voter meets the election process is typically at the county level. In some states, Michigan, Wisconsin, some parts of New England, it's at an even more local level. It's at the town or township level. But local governments are not flush generally, and the election office inside that framework is particularly, it's operating on a particularly skinny amount of resources. Our research that we report in the book shows that if you compare a local election office budget, a typical election office budget to a county budget, the election office share is 0.5%. 0.5%. And so when you look at the things that are being done around the country, new voting systems, adapting to the changes and the pressures of cybersecurity and the pandemic and the constant shifting political sands, having skill, having knowledge, having a deep sort of bedrock of information and resources and best practices, I think is important. People need to be able to see each other and communicate and get together to share that sort of stuff. So if I had all the money in the world, I would spend some of my money on education and training, because it makes a difference, and we know it does.
Yeah,
Mitchell, how would you spend your money?
Yeah, right. So I just add to that there's a part of this that a part of like what underlies what we're talking about in this book is this real deep understanding of the evolution of professionalization of election administration in the country. From a place where in some places the election official was the first person who showed up to cast a ballot, right? 200 years ago. And so over time we get this professionalization of this field, and it's a really critical and really complex field today. But we've not put the resources towards really bolstering the education and training component of it. There are real problems with equipment in some places. There's with staffing. There's just no end of need. And these are really hardworking people who are also very much underpaid as well. I would add that, very much underpaid.
Circling back to Hans, one of your earlier questions, there will be proposals for reform that come out of the experience that we're all going through right now, and there should be, and I hope that there are many of them, and I hope that they're good, and that they're well informed, particularly by local election officials. I said before today that I haven't seen anything, or maybe not much, that sticks in my mind in the local election system that's broken enough that more resources wouldn't make a huge difference. And so, before we scrap something that's awfully hard to scrap, given the way it's embedded in centuries of state law, maybe paying for what we'd like to see happen would be a good choice.
Great, thank you. There are other questions regarding best practices in the election system and also outcome in November. So maybe I read both of them and you can try to address them together. One is, given your position on maintaining local control of elections administration, how effective do you find the EAC in helping to identify and disseminate best practices? And the other one focuses on the outcome of the November election based on what you know of the voting process. Will you be confident in the validity of the outcome in November?
I think Hans should answer that question.
That's why we have a panel of.
Yeah. Now you say that, Nicoletta. Now you say that. Okay. The EAC, established as a clearinghouse. It's about 20 years old. Not as well funded now as it used to be. They do a wonderful job in reaching as far as they can reach. Their focus in recent years has necessarily been around federal funding and how to best distribute that. And I certainly don't want to speak for any of the commissioners. I know them all, and I admire and respect all of the work that they do. I think it's also true that local jurisdictions feel a need that isn't being met. And so state election offices may be, may feel differently about this, and probably do. But again, as Mitchell mentioned, there are, the conservative count is 8,000 local offices, and it's probably, if you look at townships and towns, it's probably closer to 12. So that's a lot of reach, and it's no wonder that we would choose to distribute federal funds through state offices in the territories.
Yeah, to the second question, I'll only say there's no perfect administrative process, but I do have faith in our system, and I really do want to hear what Hans has to say.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think we've been dancing around it in different ways several times. I mean, I think what I would say is, so like what we know, including what we know from this book, is that the system itself, when it works the way it is set up to work, including with all of the possible, because human beings make mistakes and everything else, I have very little doubt that it will work, and we can tally the votes and we can have a result. That seems like it's okay. The process of mail-in ballots, even with the potential for problems with the U.S. Postal Service and everything else, I think it'll be, I feel pretty okay with the system. The problem, the concern that I would see is that precisely because of the complexity that is really well documented here, right, there's lots of avenues for a mistake that someone could then exploit. Right, because what should happen is that the election happens, and then afterwards we get the tallies, and then it moves along to the next step, and then the president doesn't certify it. Instead, different stages and things get moved, and then eventually get sent. The electors get chosen, they get sent to Congress. It's open, big ceremonies, and all that. And that should be the way it goes. And if there are procedures for if there's disputes at that level, and those are done in Congress. But what you can see happening is that there's a point early on in the process where there's some question about how the ballots are being counted, or which ones are being counted, or which ones are not appropriate, like we saw in 2000 with the recount in Florida. And then that's an opening for a legal challenge. And then the lawyers get involved, and the parties get involved with this legal. And because of the complexity, it's really difficult to imagine, to identify in advance what that's going to be. But believe me, the lawyers are looking at it, and they're finding those places, and they know where those gaps are. And then they find something to exploit, and they say this is to be challenged, so therefore we're going to challenge the result out of Florida or Pennsylvania or whatever the state is that's a swing state, or multiple states that are swing states. And then once it's involved in the court system, then it's no longer a question about the actual election administration. Then it's a question about the political system and the court system, and who is, and how that's going to be, how that will be engaged with. I think then on top of that, there is just the question of we're in a place without a lot of precedent, right? So someone might say, well, the legislature can step in and do this or that. Well, but we don't, I can tell you what I know the legislature is allowed to do, but if the legislature does something that's not what I tell you I know they're allowed to do, I can't stop them, right? Because there's what's the precedent there? And so how things played out in 2000 is not what I think should have happened, but it's what happened. And I think that's the question. And so should we be worried that something really weird should play out? Well, usually I'd say no, but then when you have people who are saying they want weird things to play out, then you start to be suspicious and worried. That's I think the place. to worry. Not that I think that anything seems likely to fall apart because of the way that the system works or is supposed to work, but because we have people who are saying they're going to try to exploit the just natural human openings that exist in any system. That's my not very optimistic take, and someone else has to have the last word, because I can't let that be the last word.
I don't know that I want to have the last word necessarily, but I will echo Mitchell's thoughts, which is that I am tremendously optimistic about the skill and the effort that local election offices and the state chief election officials offices that support them, that they're doing everything they can to have the election run according to plan, according to the process, and that every vote will be counted as cast, and every vote that isn't counted, because some can't be counted, will be accounted for. If we can let the process run long enough to count the votes, I have great faith in the outcome. I think that's what we expect. I think that's what the average person expects. It's what we deserve.
Well, thank you. It looks like we're approaching the end of the event. I don't know, Al, is there time for another question from you, or should we stop here? It's 6:30.
I think in these the days we're in right now, that to end on that note of optimism would be an antidote to the despair that some of us are feeling. So it seems like a good plan.
Call us anytime.
Well, then, thank you so much to this wonderful panel and to our audience for this incredible adventure in the complexities of the voting system. I wish to close with a reference to a concept that you explain in your book, the idea that what we commonly call a vote is actually an attempt to vote. And this intrigued me a great deal. So it becomes an actual vote if it is, as you say, cast in a timely manner and by an eligible voter. And so, borrowing this concept, my concluding remark and wish to all of us is, let's make our best attempt to vote. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. It was wonderful. We've all learned a great deal, and congratulations on the book. People were asking about the second edition. We hope there will soon be a second edition, including recent developments.
Well, thank you all very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you all very much. It's been an honor. We really appreciate the opportunity to meet you all, and so much appreciate you reading and thinking about our work.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.